Jake Martinez pressed his face against the cold window of his dormitory room and watched the twin suns of Nexus Prime rise over the crystal towers of the Galactic Academy. The sight still amazed him after 6 months of living here. Back on Earth, he had been just another college student studying engineering in Minneapolis. Now he was one of only 12 humans chosen for the most prestigious exchange program in the galaxy. The Academy grounds stretched out below him like something from a dream. Floating platforms carried students between buildings that seemed to grow from the ground like massive crystals. Gardens filled with plants from dozens of worlds created patches of impossible colors against the silver architecture. But what caught Jake's attention this morning were the maintenance crews working on something huge near the North Campus. They were building an ice structure. Even from his window high up in the residential tower, Jake could see the massive walls of clear ice rising from the ground. Steam poured from cooling units as big as trucks, and workers in heavy suits moved around the construction site like tiny figures in a snow globe. Jake knew what it was. Every student at the Academy had heard about the ice maze. It was the final test for advanced environmental sciences, and it had a reputation that made even the bravest students nervous. Professor HFY, who taught the class, was famous for saying that the maze separated true scientists from those who just studied science. A soft chime from his door interrupted his thoughts. Jake opened it to find his roommate Chun Liu standing in the hallway with 2 cups of hot coffee. Chun was also from Earth, chosen from a university in Beijing, and the 2 humans had become close friends during their time at the Academy. "Morning, Jake," Chun said, handing him a cup. "Ready for today's announcement?" Jake took the coffee gratefully. The Academy kept all buildings at a temperature comfortable for most species, which meant it was always a bit cold for humans. "You think HFY will really make us do the maze?" "My friend from Kepler Station took the class last year," Chun replied. "She said 3 students ended up in the medical wing. One of them was a thermalite who supposedly could handle any temperature." They walked together toward the main academic building, joining streams of other students heading to morning classes. The diversity still impressed Jake every day. Tall, elegant Cepharians glided past on gossamer wings, their pale blue skin shimmering in the morning light. A group of thermalites walked by, their rock-like bodies glowing with internal heat that made the air shimmer around them. Near the fountain, several Aquarians sat in shallow pools, their gills opening and closing as they breathed both air and water. Jake had learned to identify most of the 17 species represented at the Academy, but he still felt like an outsider. Sometimes, humans were new to the galactic community, and many of the other species saw them as primitive newcomers. Earth had only made contact with alien civilizations 50 years ago, while some of these species had been traveling between stars for thousands of years. "There's Amy and Steve," Chun said, pointing toward the entrance of the academic building. Amy Rodriguez and Steve Johnson were the other 2 humans in their advanced environmental sciences class. Amy came from a research station in Antarctica, while Steve grew up on a farming colony on Mars. The 4 humans often stuck together, finding comfort in their shared Earth heritage. "Did you guys see the construction?" Amy asked as they approached. She looked worried, her dark eyes scanning the faces of passing alien students. "Everyone's talking about the maze test." Steve nodded grimly. "I heard it's not just cold. The whole thing is designed to mess with your head. The walls move, the temperature changes without warning, and there are puzzles you have to solve while your brain is freezing." They entered the building and made their way to Professor HFY's classroom. The professor was from a species called the crystallines, who evolved on a world where the average temperature was 50 degrees below freezing. HFY looked like a living sculpture made of clear blue ice, beautiful and intimidating at the same time. Her voice had a musical quality that somehow made even bad news sound elegant. The classroom was arranged in a circular amphitheater, with seats for about 60 students. Jake and his friends found their usual spots near the middle, where they could see and hear everything clearly. Around them, students from different worlds settled into seats designed for their various body types. Professor HFY entered exactly on time, as she always did. Her crystalline form caught the light and threw rainbow patterns on the walls as she moved to the center of the room. She stood silently for a moment, her pale blue eyes scanning the assembled students. "Today, we will discuss your final examination," she began, her voice filling the room without effort. "The adaptive environment assessment has been a tradition at this academy for over 300 years. It tests not only your knowledge of environmental science, but your ability to function when comfort and safety are stripped away." A nervous murmur ran through the classroom. Jake noticed that some of the Zephyrians were unconsciously folding their wings closer to their bodies, while the Aquarians shifted uncomfortably in their moisture suits. "The test takes place in our newly constructed ice maze," Professor HFY continued. "The structure contains 3 kilometers of corridors, chambers, and passages, all maintained at a temperature of -40 degrees Celsius. You will enter alone, navigate to the center, retrieve a data crystal containing your personal assignment, and return to the entrance." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "You will have 2 hours. The maze layout changes every 30 minutes to prevent anyone from following another's path. Emergency beacons will transport you to safety, but using one results in automatic failure of the course." A Zephyrian student named Silwind raised one delicate hand. "Professor, what about environmental suits? Surely we're allowed protective equipment?" "Standard Academy cold weather gear is available," HFY replied. "However, the test is designed to evaluate your natural adaptability. Excessive reliance on technology defeats the purpose." Jake felt a strange mixture of nerves and excitement. Growing up in Minnesota, he had spent countless hours outdoors in sub-zero temperatures. Ice skating, hockey, winter camping with his scout troop, shoveling snow for neighbors. What sounded like torture to his alien classmates sounded familiar to him. "When will the test take place?" asked a Thermalite student whose name Jake couldn't pronounce. "1 week from today," Professor HFY announced. "I suggest you use the time to prepare both physically and mentally. This test has a 30% failure rate, and those who fail typically do so not because of a cold, but because of panic." After class, Jake walked with his friends toward the cafeteria, but their usual chatter was subdued. Other students around them were talking anxiously about the coming test. He overheard a group of Zephyrians discussing whether their wing membranes would become too brittle to function in extreme cold. Some Thermalites were calculating how quickly their internal energy reserves would drain in such temperatures. "I'm scared," Amy admitted quietly as they found a table. "Antarctica was cold, but at least I had proper equipment and heated shelters. This sounds like a survival test designed by someone who wants us to fail." "Maybe that's the point," Steve sighed thoughtfully. HFY said it tests natural adaptability. Maybe the lesson is about working with what you have instead of relying on technology. Chun shook his head. "Easy for you to say. You grew up on Mars where the weather control systems kept everything comfortable. I'm from Beijing. The coldest it ever got there was maybe 10 below zero, and that was with heated buildings everywhere." Jake listened to his friend's concerns while thinking about his own childhood. Winters in Minnesota regularly dropped to 20 or 30 below zero, and that was before considering wind chill. His family had a cabin up north where they went ice fishing even when the temperature hit 40 below. He remembered his father teaching him how to dress in layers, how to keep his extremities warm, how to recognize the early signs of hypothermia. "We'll figure it out," Jake said finally. "Humans have been dealing with cold for thousands of years. We survived ice ages before we had any technology at all." But as he looked around the cafeteria at his alien classmates, Jake realized that most species hadn't faced such challenges. The Zephyrians came from a world of eternal warm winds. The Thermalites evolved on volcanic planets. The Aquarians lived in temperate oceans. Earth's harsh and variable climate had forced humans to become adaptable in ways that other species never needed to develop. For the first time since arriving at the Academy, Jake wondered if being human might actually be an advantage instead of a disadvantage. The thought both excited and worried him as he contemplated the ice maze waiting in the distance. The next morning, Jake found himself in the Academy's massive library, surrounded by towering shelves that stretched up into the artificial sky above. The library was designed to accommodate all species, with sections kept at different temperatures and atmospheric pressures. Jake sat at a study terminal in the human-friendly zone, researching everything he could find about environmental adaptation and cold weather survival around him. Other students were doing the same thing. But Jake noticed something interesting. As he listened to their conversations, most of them were focused on finding technological solutions to the cold problem. The Zephyrians were discussing heated clothing systems. The Aquarians were researching advanced moisture retention devices. Everyone seemed to think the answer lay in better equipment. The human section is climate controlled to 22 degrees Celsius, he heard a Zephyrian student named Whisperwing say to her study partner. How can they possibly handle -40? Their skin will freeze solid in minutes. Her friend Driftsail nodded agreement. I heard humans don't even have fur or natural insulation. They're basically naked mammals from a warm planet. It's cruel to make them take the same test as us. Jake kept his head down and continued reading, but he couldn't help feeling annoyed. Earth wasn't exactly a warm planet. Sure, some parts were tropical, but huge areas spent months every year buried under snow and ice. His hometown of Duluth regularly saw temperatures that would terrify these aliens. At the next table, a group of Thermalites were having their own discussion about humans. Their rocky bodies glowed softly with internal heat as they talked. The bipeds from Earth puzzle me, rumbled one whose name sounded like falling rocks. They have no internal heating system, no thick hide, no natural cold protection. How did such a species even survive to develop space travel? Perhaps their planet is warmer than reported, suggested another. The climate data must be wrong. No intelligent species could evolve in the harsh conditions they claim Earth experiences. Jake wanted to laugh. If they thought Earth was harsh, they had never experienced a Minnesota blizzard or an ice storm that knocked out power for weeks. But he stayed quiet and kept studying. Later that day, Jake attended his individual consultation with Dr. Kethara, the Academy's chief physiology professor. Her office was filled with holographic displays showing the anatomy of dozens of different species. As an Aquarian, she kept her office humid and slightly cool, with small fountains providing the sound of running water. Sit down, Jake, Dr. Kethara sighed, her gills fluttering nervously as she spoke. I must express my concerns about your participation in the ice maze test. Jake settled into the chair, which adjusted automatically to human proportions. What kind of concerns, Doctor? Physiological ones, she replied, calling up a holographic display of human anatomy. Look at this. Humans have thin skin with minimal insulation. Your blood vessels are close to the surface, making you vulnerable to rapid heat loss. You lack the internal heating systems of thermalites, the insulating fur of frostlings, or the cold-adapted metabolism of crystallines. The display showed Jake's circulatory system in glowing blue lines. Dr. Kethara pointed to various areas with obvious worry. Your extremities are particularly vulnerable, she continued. Human fingers and toes have poor circulation in cold conditions. Your ears and nose are exposed and unprotected. Most concerning of all, your brain function deteriorates rapidly when your core temperature drops even slightly. Jake nodded politely, but inside he was thinking about all the times he had been ice fishing with his father when the temperature was 30 below zero. His brain had seemed to work just fine then. "I'm recommending you for a medical exemption from the test," Dr. Gethara said. "It's simply too dangerous for your species. Professor Vex High can arrange an alternative assessment." "Thank you for your concern, Doctor," Jake replied carefully, "but I'd like to try the test with everyone else." Dr. Kethara's large eyes widened in surprise. "Jake, I don't think you understand the severity of the situation. Hypothermia can set in within minutes at negative 40 degrees. Your species simply isn't equipped for such extremes." "I appreciate your worry," Jake said, "but humans are tougher than you might think. We've been dealing with cold weather for a very long time." After leaving the doctor's office, Jake made his way to the equipment center where students could check out cold weather gear for the test. The center was busy with aliens trying on various suits and devices. Jake watched a Zephyrian struggling to fit heating elements around his delicate wings, while nearby, a thermalite was testing an energy conservation unit designed to help regulate his internal temperature. The equipment manager, an efficient crystalline named Claythought, looked surprised when Jake approached the counter. "Mr. Martinez," Claythought said, his voice tinkling like wind chimes. "I wasn't expecting you. Dr. Kethara informed me that humans would likely require special accommodation for the test." "I'd just like the standard cold weather gear, please," Jake said. Claythought hesitated. "Are you certain?" "I have access to experimental heating suits designed for warm planet species. There's also a new atmospheric bubble system that could maintain Earth normal temperature around you." Jake shook his head. "Just the regular stuff, thanks." The standard gear turned out to be a basic insulated suit, thermal boots, gloves, and a breathing mask to prevent lung damage from extremely cold air. Jake tried everything on and found it adequate, but not ideal. The suit was designed for species that naturally ran warmer than humans, so it wasn't quite thick enough. The gloves were too large for human hands, and the boots were clunky. That evening, Jake video called his family back on Earth. The connection across interstellar space took a few seconds, but soon his parents and younger sister Lisa appeared on his room's display screen. "Jake," Lisa exclaimed, her face lighting up. "How's space school?" "Pretty good," Jake replied with a grin, "though I might need some advice. We have this test coming up where we have to navigate a maze in 40 below zero weather." His father, a construction worker who spent every winter working outdoors in Minnesota, laughed. 40 below? That's not so bad. Remember that cold snap 3 years ago when we went ice fishing on Lake Superior? It hit 50 below with the wind chill, and we stayed out there for 6 hours. The important thing is layering, his mother added. She worked as a park ranger and knew about cold weather. Survival. Don't rely too much on fancy equipment. Your body's natural systems work better when they're not fighting against artificial heating. "Are you allowed to modify the gear they give you?" Lisa asked. At 16, she was already an accomplished hockey player who practiced outdoors even. "In the worst weather, I think so," Jake said. "Why?" "The key is air circulation," Lisa explained. "Too much insulation actually makes you colder because you can't move properly and you start sweating. And the sweat freezes and you're in real trouble." His family spent the next hour giving him advice that no alien professor had ever mentioned. How to layer clothing to create warming air pockets. How to keep his extremities warm through movement and circulation. How to breathe properly in extreme cold to avoid lung damage. How to recognize the early signs of hypothermia and frostbite. Most importantly, they taught him the mental approach his grandfather had passed down from his logging days in northern Wisconsin. Don't fight the cold, his father said. Work with it. Accept that you're going to be uncomfortable, but know that discomfort isn't the same as danger. Your body knows how to handle cold better than you think it does. After the call ended, Jake spent time modifying his gear based on his family's advice. He adjusted the suit's ventilation, added extra insulation to key areas, and practiced the breathing techniques his mother had taught him. Most importantly, he prepared himself mentally for what was coming. The next few days passed quickly as other students continued their frantic preparations. Jake watched Zephyrians testing heating systems that could keep their wing membranes flexible. Thermalites practiced energy conservation techniques to extend their internal heating. Aquarians worked with moisture suits, designed to prevent their skin from freezing. Everyone seemed to assume that survival in the maze would depend on having the right technology and avoiding the cold as much as possible. Jake was probably the only student preparing to work with the cold instead of against it. 2 days before the test, Jake overheard a conversation that bothered him more than he expected. He was eating lunch when a group of advanced students from various species sat down at a nearby table. "I feel sorry for those human students," said a senior Zephyrian. "They're brave to attempt the maze, but it's basically suicide for their species." "Agreed," rumbled a Thermalite. "Humans are impressive in many ways, but extreme environment survival isn't one of their strengths. They're too dependent on technology and artificial climate control. Their homeworld is quite temperate," added an Aquarian. "They simply haven't evolved the natural adaptations needed for extreme cold. It's not their fault, but facts are facts." Jake finished his meal in silence, but their words echoed in his mind. Everyone at the academy saw humans as the newcomers, the primitive species that had barely figured out space travel. The morning of the test arrived with an artificial blizzard that the academy's weather systems had created around the ice maze. Jake stood with the other students in a heated waiting area, watching snow swirl around the massive crystalline structure. That would determine their academic fate. The maze looked even more intimidating than it had during construction, with walls of clear ice that reflected and refracted light in confusing patterns. 63 students from 17 different species waited nervously for their turns. Professor Vex High had arranged the test order randomly, which meant Jake would be somewhere in the middle of the group. He watched his fellow students make last-minute adjustments to their equipment and tried to calm his own nerves. The first student called was Sil Wind, a Zephyrian who had always been confident in class. His gossamer wings were covered with heating elements that glowed softly against his pale blue skin. He wore a complex environmental suit that monitored his body, temperature, and automatically adjusted heating levels. As he approached the maze entrance, Silwind looked ready for anything. "Remember," Professor Vex High announced to the waiting students, "you have 2 hours to reach the center, retrieve your data crystal, and return. The maze layout changes every 30 minutes, so do not attempt to follow someone else's path. Emergency. Beacons will extract you safely, but using one means immediate failure." The entrance to the maze was a simple archway carved from ice. Beyond it, Jake could see corridors stretching in multiple directions, their walls so clear they seemed to disappear in places. The whole structure was designed to be disorienting even before the cold became a factor. Silwind stepped through the entrance with graceful confidence. His wings carried him smoothly over the icy floor, and his heating suit kept his body temperature stable. For the first few minutes, everything seemed to be going perfectly. Then Jake noticed the Zephyrians' movements becoming less coordinated. Through the transparent walls, students could watch Silwind's progress, and something was clearly wrong. His wing beats were becoming irregular, and he kept stopping to rest against the walls. "His wing membranes are stiffening," whispered another Zephyrian student named Drift Sail. "The heating elements can't keep up with the extreme cold." As they watched, Silwind's graceful flight became clumsy stumbling. His species had evolved for warm air currents, and their delicate wing membranes were never meant to function in such extreme cold. The heating elements were working, but they created uneven warming that made his wings even more difficult to control. 20 minutes into his attempt, Silwind crashed into a wall and slid to the ground. He tried to get up, but his coordination was clearly failing. The cold wasn't just affecting his wings now. His whole body was slowing down as his metabolism struggled to cope with the extreme temperature. Jake watched as Silwind pulled out his emergency beacon and activated it. Within seconds, a rescue team appeared and transported him to safety. The first student had failed, and he hadn't even made it a quarter of the way to the center. The second student was a thermalite named Magma Core. His rocky body glowed with internal heat, and Jake had expected him to do well in the cold environment. Thermalites were known for their ability to regulate their own temperature, generating heat through internal chemical processes. Magma Core entered the maze with confidence. His body radiating warmth had melted the ice around his feet. For the first 10 minutes, he made steady progress through the corridors, using his natural heat generation to stay comfortable. But Jake began to notice problems developing. The extreme cold was forcing Magma Core to burn through his energy reserves much faster than normal. His body was working overtime to maintain temperature, and the effort was exhausting him. Worse, the heat he generated was creating steam that immediately froze on his rocky exterior, building up layers of ice that made him heavier and clumsy. Magma Core progressed deeper into the maze. His internal glow began to dim. His species could generate heat, but it came at a cost. The energy expenditure required to maintain warmth in 40 below temperatures was enormous, and his reserves were draining rapidly. 30 minutes into his attempt, Magma Core was moving. Very slowly, struggling under the weight of ice that had built up on his body. His internal heat was flickering like a dying flame, and his movements were becoming sluggish. He made it halfway to the center before collapsing from exhaustion. Too drained to continue, the third student was an Aquarian named Tideflow. Her species had evolved in temperate oceans, and she wore an advanced moisture retention suit designed to keep her skin from drying out. The suit also had heating elements to prevent her from freezing. Tideflow's attempt was the shortest so far. Her respiratory system, designed to extract oxygen from both air and water, became a liability in the extreme cold. Despite her environmental suit, the frigid air began affecting her gills and lung tissue. Her skin, even protected by the moisture suit, started showing signs of freezing damage within minutes. She made it only to the first checkpoint before hypothermia began setting in. Her species' dependence on maintaining proper moisture and temperature levels made them particularly vulnerable to extreme cold. Tideflow activated her emergency beacon after just 15 minutes, looking pale and shaken as the rescue team carried her away. Student after student entered the maze, and student after student failed. A crystalline named Ice Shard, who everyone expected to excel in the cold environment, discovered that his species' adaptation to cold was specific to their homeworld's conditions. The maze's artificial cold was different somehow, and his natural defenses weren't working properly. A Frostling student covered in thick white fur lasted longer than most, but even her natural insulation couldn't cope with the psychological pressure of the maze. She became lost and disoriented, panicking when the walls shifted and changed around her. Fear made her breathing rapid and shallow, which led to rapid heat loss and eventual hypothermia. Each failure followed a similar pattern. Students entered the maze relying heavily on their natural adaptations or technological solutions. When those advantages proved insufficient, they had no backup plan. The combination of extreme cold, psychological pressure, and physical challenge overwhelmed them one by one. Jake watched it all from the waiting area, learning from each attempt. He noticed that students who moved too quickly exhausted themselves and generated sweat that immediately froze. Those who moved too slowly lost too much body heat and became sluggish. The maze wasn't just testing cold tolerance. It was testing the ability to maintain physical and mental function under extreme stress. "This is impossible," whispered Chun Liu, who was scheduled to go just before Jake. "Look at all these species with natural cold adaptations, and they're all failing. What chance do we humans have?" Amy Rodriguez nodded grimly. Maybe Dr. Cathara was right. Maybe we should have taken the medical exemption. Steve Johnson shook his head. "It's too late now. We're committed." Jake listened to his friend's worried conversation, but he was thinking about something else. All the failed students had one thing in common. They were fighting against the cold, trying to overcome it with technology or natural advantages. They saw the extreme temperature as an enemy to be defeated rather than an environment to be navigated. Growing up in Minnesota, Jake had learned a different approach. You didn't fight winter. You worked with it. You accepted that you would be cold and uncomfortable, but you knew the difference between discomfort and danger. You prepared properly, moved efficiently, and most importantly, you stayed calm. The failures he was watching weren't really about species adaptations or equipment. They were about mindset. Every student who had entered the maze so far was approaching it as a survival challenge, something to be endured until they could escape back to warmth and safety. Jake had spent his entire childhood in conditions similar to the maze. To him, 40 below wasn't a survival situation. It was just winter. And winter was something you lived in, not something you survived through. When Chun's name was called, Jake watched his friend walk toward the maze entrance with obvious dread. Chun was bundled in the maximum amount of insulation in the academy. Allowed, and he was still shivering before he even entered the cold zone. "Good luck," Jake called out, and Chun gave him a nervous wave before disappearing into the ice corridors. Chun lasted 25 minutes before activating his emergency beacon. He had moved too cautiously, trying to conserve warmth, and the slow pace had allowed the cold to gradually overcome his defenses. When Jake saw him being carried out, Chun was conscious but clearly suffering from hypothermia. Amy went next and lasted 18 minutes. Steve managed 32 minutes, the longest of any human so far, but even he eventually succumbed to the combination of cold and stress. As Jake's name was called, he looked around at the remaining students. More than half the class had already failed, including students from species that were supposedly adapted for cold environments. The maze had a 100% failure rate so far. Professor Vex High looked at Jake with obvious concern as he approached the entrance. "Mr. Martinez, are you certain you wish to attempt this? Given your species' vulnerability to cold environments, no one would think less of you for accepting a medical exemption." Jake stepped through the ice archway and felt the familiar bite of extreme cold against his face. The temperature inside the maze was exactly what Professor Vex High had promised, 40 degrees below zero. It was the kind of cold that made the air feel thick and sharp in his lungs, the kind that turned breath into clouds of steam that froze before they could drift away. But Jake had felt this cold before. Many times. He paused just inside the entrance and did something that would have shocked his watching classmates. Instead of hurrying forward to get the test over with quickly, he stood still and let his body adjust to the environment. He breathed slowly and deeply, allowing his respiratory system to adapt to the frigid air. He flexed his fingers and toes, inside his gloves and boots, getting his circulation moving properly. Most importantly, he accepted the cold. He didn't fight it or fear it. He just acknowledged that he was going to be uncomfortable for the next hour or two, and that being uncomfortable wasn't the same as being in danger. Through the transparent walls, Jake could see the other students, watching him with expressions of concern and disbelief. They expected him to start shivering uncontrollably or collapse within minutes, like so many others had done. Instead, Jake calmly assessed his surroundings and began moving forward with steady, measured steps. The maze floor was covered with a layer of ice that made walking treacherous for most species. Jake had watched previous students slip and fall repeatedly, wasting energy and losing body heat as they struggled to maintain balance. But Jake's childhood had been spent on frozen ponds and icy sidewalks. His feet automatically found the spots where the ice was rougher and provided better grip. When he had to cross smooth sections, he shifted his weight and adjusted his gait in ways that came naturally after years of navigating Minnesota winters. The first challenge came at a junction where 3 corridors branched off in different directions. Each passage had a puzzle mounted on the wall, mathematical problems that had to be solved to determine the correct path. Jake had watched other students struggle with these puzzles as the cold slowed their thinking and made concentration difficult, but Jake's mind remained clear. The cold that had muddled the thoughts of alien students was just another environmental factor to him, no more distracting than wind or rain. He solved the first puzzle quickly, determining that the middle corridor was the correct choice, and moved on without hesitation. As he progressed deeper into the maze, Jake began to appreciate the advantages his human physiology provided. Other students had complained about their extremities going numb, but Jake kept his hands and feet warm through constant small movements and proper circulation, techniques his father had taught him. When his fingers started to get cold, he clenched and unclenched his fists inside his gloves. When his toes began to feel numb, he wiggled them and shifted his weight from foot to foot. The maze's psychological challenges, designed to create panic and disorientation, had little effect on Jake. The constantly changing walls and confusing reflections in the ice were meant to make students feel lost and afraid. But Jake had spent countless hours in whiteout blizzards, where visibility was zero and every direction looked the same. He knew how to stay calm when the environment became hostile and confusing. 20 minutes into his attempt, Jake reached a section where the temperature dropped even further. Warning signs indicated that this area was maintained at 50 degrees below zero, cold enough to cause immediate frostbite in unprotected skin. Several students had turned back at this point, unwilling to risk serious injury. Jake paused at the warning signs and checked his equipment. His breathing mask was working properly, preventing ice crystals from forming in his lungs. His insulated suit was keeping his core temperature stable. His extremities were still warm and functional. He had no doubt that he could handle the increased cold, so he continued forward. The corridor beyond the warning signs was the most challenging yet. The walls were covered with frost that created strange shapes and shadows, making it difficult to see clearly. The floor was slick with black ice, the most dangerous kind to walk on. Worst of all, the puzzle in this section was complex, requiring sustained concentration while dealing with extreme discomfort. Jake approached the puzzle methodically. It was a 3-dimensional logic problem displayed on a screen built into the ice wall. Numbers and symbols moved in patterns that had to be analyzed and decoded. The extreme cold was making the screen sluggish, and frost kept forming on its surface. Instead of rushing through the problem, Jake took his time. He cleared frost from the screen with his gloved hand, studied the patterns carefully, and worked through the logic step by step. His mind remained sharp despite the brutal cold. Where other students had become confused and made mistakes, Jake stayed focused and solved the puzzle correctly on his first attempt. The next section of the maze tested physical endurance as much as cold tolerance. Jake had to crawl through a tunnel barely large enough for a human body, with ice-covered walls that pressed against him from all sides. The tunnel was long enough that he couldn't see the exit when he entered, and the confined space would have triggered claustrophobia in many students. But Jake had crawled through snow caves and ice shelters during winter camping trips. The tunnel was uncomfortable and cold, but it wasn't frightening. He moved through it steadily, using his elbows and knees to pull himself forward, keeping his breathing controlled to avoid creating too much moisture that would freeze inside. The confined space dot when he emerged from the tunnel, Jake found himself in a large chamber with multiple levels connected by ice-covered ramps and platforms. This was clearly designed to test balance and coordination while dealing with extreme cold. Students who were shivering or moving clumsily would find it almost impossible to navigate safely. Jake moved through the chamber like he was back on the hockey rink in his hometown. His balance on the icy surfaces was natural and confident. When he needed to change direction quickly, he used hockey stops and turns that distributed his weight properly and prevented slipping. When he had to climb the ramps, he used the same techniques he had learned for walking on icy hills and slopes. 40 minutes into his attempt, Jake realized he was enjoying himself. The maze was challenging and uncomfortable, but it was also familiar in a way that surprised him. Every technique he was using, every problem he was solving, came from his childhood experiences with harsh winter conditions. The test that had defeated students with natural cold adaptations and advanced technology was just a more complex version of things he had been doing since he was old enough to walk. The center of the maze was a circular chamber with data crystals, mounted on pedestals around the perimeter. Each crystal was labeled with a student's name and contained their individual assignment. Jake found his crystal quickly and checked the time. He had used only 45 minutes to reach the center, faster than any previous student. But Jake wasn't done yet. As he prepared to head back to the entrance, he heard something through the maze's communication system. Emergency signals were coming from 3 different locations. Students were in trouble and needed help. Jake looked at his data crystal then, at the emergency signals on his scanner. He could head straight back to the entrance and complete his test successfully. Or he could use his advantage in the cold environment to help his fellow students who were trapped and potentially in danger. There was really no choice to make. Jake tucked his data crystal into a secure pocket and began moving toward the nearest emergency signal. The student was a Zephyrian named Whisperwing, who had become lost when the maze walls shifted. She was huddled in a corner, her wings wrapped around her body for warmth, clearly suffering from hypothermia. "I'm here to help," Jake said, kneeling beside her. "Can you move?" Whisperwing looked at him in amazement. "Jake, how are you not freezing? You're just wearing the basic gear." "Long story?" Jake replied. "Right now we need to get you warmed up and moving. Can you follow me?" He helped Whisperwing to her feet and began guiding her toward the nearest exit route. Her movements were sluggish from the cold, but Jake's presence and calm confidence seemed to help her focus. They moved slowly but steadily through the corridors, with Jake providing support and encouragement. After delivering Whisperwing to a rescue station, Jake went after the second emergency signal, then the third. Each rescue took time and energy, but Jake's comfort in the cold environment made him the ideal person to help students who were struggling. By the time Jake finally made his way back to the maze entrance, he had been inside for over an hour and a half. Professor HFY and Dr. Kethara were waiting for him with expressions of amazement and concern. "Mr. Martinez," Professor HFY said as Jake emerged from the maze, "you have not only completed the test successfully, but you've also assisted in 3 emergency rescues. How do you feel?" Jake pulled off his breathing mask and grinned. "Cold, but fine. It reminded me of winter back home." Dr. Kethara stared at him in disbelief. "You spent 90 minutes in conditions that incapacitated students from cold adapted. Species? And you're describing it as reminiscent of home? The news of Jake's performance in the ice maze spread through the Galactic Academy faster than anyone expected. By the next morning, students from all 17 species were talking about the human who had not only completed the impossible test, but had also rescued 3 other students while doing it. The story grew with each telling, but the basic facts remained the same and shocking. Jake found himself at the center of attention in a way that made him uncomfortable. As he walked to breakfast, conversation stopped and students stared at him, with expressions ranging from amazement to disbelief. Some of the Zephyrians who had dismissed humans as fragile were now looking at him like he was some kind of superhero. "Is it true you spent 90 minutes in the maze?" asked a crystalline student named Clearmind as Jake sat down with his meal. "And that you weren't even using advanced equipment?" "Just the standard deer," Jake replied, feeling awkward about all the attention. It really wasn't that big a deal. But it was a big deal to everyone else. Dr. Cathara had spent the entire night reviewing Jake's medical data from the test, trying to understand how a human had outperformed species that were supposedly adapted for extreme cold. The readings showed that Jake's body temperature had remained stable throughout the test. His cognitive function had never declined, and his physical coordination had actually improved as he spent more time in the cold environment. Professor Vexhai called an emergency faculty meeting to discuss the implications of Jake's performance. The test results were so unexpected that some professors initially suspected equipment malfunction or cheating. But the maze was monitored by dozens of sensors, and every moment of Jake's attempt had been recorded from multiple angles. The human student's performance challenges everything we thought we knew about his species, Professor Vexhai announced to the assembled faculty. He navigated the maze with a confidence and skill that exceeded our best predictions for any student, regardless of species. Dr. Cathara stood up to present her analysis. "I've reviewed Jake Martinez's physiological data extensively. His body's response to extreme cold shows adaptations we never suspected humans possessed. His circulatory system maintained efficient blood flow to his extremities. His respiratory system processed the frigid air without damage. And most remarkably, his brain function actually improved under stress conditions that incapacitated other students." The faculty meeting lasted for hours as professors from different departments tried to understand what they had witnessed. The revelation that humans might be far more adaptable than anyone had realized sent shockwaves through the academic community. Meanwhile, Jake was trying to go about his normal routine, but everywhere he went, students wanted to ask him questions about the test. During his advanced physics class, a thermalite student named Heatcore raised his hand to ask about human cold adaptation instead of the lesson material. "Jake, my species generates internal heat to survive in cold environments," Heatcore said. "But in the maze, my natural heating system worked against me. How did you stay warm without any internal heat source?" Jake thought about how to explain it. "Well, humans had been dealing with cold for thousands of years. We learned to work with our environment instead of fighting against it. When it's cold, you move efficiently, you layer your clothing properly, and you stay calm. Panicking makes everything worse." "But your species has no natural cold adaptations," protested a frostling student covered in thick white fur. "How can you be better at handling extreme cold than species who evolved for it?" "Maybe that's exactly why," Jake said, surprising himself with the insight. "You evolved for specific cold conditions on your homeworlds. Humans evolved for variable conditions. We had to learn to adapt to anything Earth could throw at us." The conversation was interrupted by an announcement over the Academy's communication system. All students were to report to the main auditorium for a special assembly. Jake had a sinking feeling that he knew what the assembly would be about. The auditorium was packed with students from all species, along with faculty members and even some visiting researchers who had heard about the maze test results. Jake tried to sit in the back, but his classmates insisted he move to the front where everyone could see him. Professor HFY took the stage and called for quiet. Her crystalline form caught the lights and threw rainbow patterns across the ceiling as she began to speak. Yesterday's ice maze test produced results that have forced us to reconsider some fundamental assumptions about species adaptation and survival capabilities, she announced. One student not only completed the test successfully, but demonstrated abilities that exceeded our best theoretical predictions. Jake felt his face getting red as all eyes in the auditorium turned toward him. He wished he could disappear into his seat. Jake Martinez from Earth completed the maze in record time while maintaining full cognitive and physical function. Professor HFY continued. More importantly, he used his advantage in the extreme environment to rescue 3 other students who were in distress. His performance raises important questions about human adaptability that deserve further study. Dr. Kethera joined Professor HFY on the stage. Our initial assessment of human cold tolerance was based on incomplete data. We assumed that because humans lack obvious cold adaptations like fur, internal heating, or specialized circulation, they would be vulnerable to extreme temperatures. We were wrong. She activated a holographic display showing comparative data from the maze test. Human physiology includes subtle but powerful adaptations that we had overlooked. Their cardiovascular system is remarkably efficient at maintaining circulation under stress. Their respiratory system handles temperature extremes better than most species. Most importantly, their neurological response to stress actually enhances performance rather than degrading it. The audience of alien students listened in fascination as Dr. Kethera explained how human evolution had produced a species uniquely suited for variable and challenging environments. Earth's climate changes, ice ages, and diverse ecosystems had forced humans to develop general adaptability rather than specialized traits. The lesson here, Professor HFY concluded, is that we must be careful not to judge a species' capabilities based on surface characteristics or obvious adaptations. Sometimes the greatest strength comes from learning to adapt to anything rather than being perfectly suited for one specific thing. After the assembly, Jake was approached by researchers from multiple departments who wanted to study human adaptability. The Academy's Evolutionary Biology Department wanted to analyze human DNA for cold adaptation genes. The Psychology Department was interested in studying human stress responses. The Environmental Sciences Department wanted Jake to help design new survival training programs. But the most unexpected request came from the Academy's administration. They offered Jake a position as the first human instructor in the Environmental Adaptation Department, teaching other species the techniques that had allowed him to succeed where others failed. "You want me to teach aliens how to handle cold weather?" Jake asked in amazement. "We want you to teach them how to think about environmental challenges the way humans do," corrected Dean Starbright, the Academy's chief administrator. "Your species approaches survival differently than any other we've encountered. That perspective could be invaluable for students facing unknown environments in their future careers." Jake thought about the offer seriously. He could help other species learn the mental and physical techniques that had allowed him to succeed. More importantly, he could help change the perception of humans as weak newcomers to the galactic community. Evening, Jake called his family to tell them about the day's events. His sister Lisa laughed when he described being offered a teaching position. "So now you're going to be Professor Jake, teaching aliens how to not freeze to death?" she teased. "I guess so," Jake replied, "though I'm not sure what I'll teach them that you couldn't learn from spending one winter in Minnesota." "Maybe that's the point," his father said thoughtfully. "You grew up thinking that surviving harsh winters was normal. To them, it's impossible. Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who make difficult things look easy." Over the following weeks, Jake's story spread beyond the Academy to the broader galactic community. Scientific journals published papers about human adaptability. News services ran stories about the species that had surprised everyone with their environmental capabilities. Earth's reputation in galactic affairs began to shift from newcomer planet to a world that had produced remarkably tough and adaptable people. The ice. Maze test remained part of the Academy's curriculum, but it was taught differently now. Students learned not just to survive in extreme environments, but to understand how different approaches to challenges could lead to unexpected success. Jake's technique of working with the environment rather than fighting against it became a standard part of the faculty curriculum. Jake accepted the teaching position and found that he enjoyed helping other species understand human approaches to problem solving. His classes became some of the most popular at the Academy, not because they were easy, but because they taught students to think differently about what was possible.